The massive crystal dome of the Galactic Council stretched high above like a frozen ocean wave, its translucent walls filtering the light of 3 different suns into dancing rainbows across the chamber floor. Ambassador Lee Minho adjusted his black uniform jacket and watched as creatures from across the galaxy took their positions at the curved amphitheater seating that spiraled down toward the central speaking platform. The Zephyrians floated in their environmental bubbles, their jellyfish-like bodies pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that shifted with their emotions. Currently, those patterns flashed angry reds and oranges. The Carathian delegation shuffled into their reinforced seats, their rock-like exoskeletons grinding against the metal with sounds like grinding stone. Even they seemed agitated, their usually stoic crystal eyes flickering with unusual activity. At the human delegation table, Minho sat alone. The other council members had made sure of that, positioning the human seating area in deliberate isolation. Around him, the chamber filled with chittering, buzzing, harmonizing voices, speaking in dozens of languages through universal translators that turned the cacophony into a symphony of discontent. Ambassador Veltar of the Hegemony Coalition slithered up to the central podium, his serpentine lower body coiling elegantly as his humanoid torso straightened to its full impressive height. His scaled skin shimmered green and gold under the chamber's lights, and when he spoke, his forked tongue flickered between words in the ancient tradition of his people. "Esteemed colleagues," Veltar began, his voice carrying easily through the acoustic perfection of the dome. "We gather today in emergency session because one species continues to treat our sacred laws as mere suggestions." A rumble of agreement rippled through the assembled delegates. The hegemony had been building this case for months, carefully documenting every human transgression, every breach of protocol, every action taken without proper council authorization. "The humans," Veltar continued, letting the word hang in the air like an accusation, "have established 17 unauthorized colonies in the Outer Rim sectors. They claim these are refugee settlements and emergency outposts, but our surveys show full industrial complexes, military installations, and thriving civilian populations." Representative Korth, whose insectoid species had held council membership for over 1,000 years, rose from his seat with a sound like breaking branches. His compound eyes reflected the chamber's light in 1,000 different directions as he clicked his mandibles in the Carathian equivalent of applause. "The Terrans ignore our territorial agreements," Korth added, his translator rendering his clicking speech into precise common. "Their merchant vessels travel through restricted space. Their military ships patrol areas under other species' jurisdiction. They negotiate trade deals that completely bypass council oversight." More voices joined the chorus of complaints. The Fee, ethereal whisper singers, beings of pure energy contained in crystalline shells, hummed their disapproval in frequencies that made the chamber's walls vibrate. The amphibious tidewalkers slapped their webbed appendages against their water-filled observation tanks in rhythmic protest. Minho listened to it all with the patience of someone who had expected this moment for years. His dark eyes moved from speaker to speaker, cataloguing their grievances, noting which species seemed genuinely angry and which were simply following the crowd. He had been humanity's representative to the Council for 8 years, and he had watched this resentment build like pressure in a plasma conduit. But most egregious of all, Veltar declared, his voice rising to fill every corner of the vast chamber, are their unauthorized military interventions. Time and again, human fleets have appeared in sovereign space, engaged in combat operations, and departed without so much as a formal notification to this council. The Hegemony ambassador activated a holographic display that showed star charts marked with red indicators. Each mark represented a location where human forces had taken action without council approval. There were dozens of them, scattered across 3 galactic arms. "The Battle of Kepler Station," Veltar continued, pointing to one of the markers. "Human warships engaged Raider Coalition forces in neutral space, claiming they were protecting civilian transports. The Proxima incident, where a human fleet destroyed an entire mining operation because they deemed it environmentally hazardous. The liberation of Titan 7, where they freed what they called enslaved workers from a perfectly legal labor contract. Each example drew more angry responses from the assembled delegates. Tentacles waved, crystals pulsed, and harmonious voices rose in discord. The humans, it seemed, had made enemies of nearly everyone. Representative Korth stood again, his massive, form-casting shadows across several nearby seats. "The pattern is clear," he declared. "Humanity believes itself above our laws, superior to our collective wisdom. They act as judge, jury, and executioner across the galaxy, imposing their primitive, moral code on advanced civilizations." "I motion for immediate expulsion," Veltar announced, his serpentine form coiling tighter with satisfaction. "Let the humans learn that chaos has consequences." The chamber erupted in agreement. Voices rose in a dozen languages, translators working overtime to render the enthusiasm into common. Representatives slammed appendages, tentacles, and claws against their seating in approval. Through it all, Ambassador Li Minho sat quietly, his expression never changing. When the noise finally died down, he rose slowly and walked to the central podium with measured steps. "I request the right to present humanity's defense before any vote is taken," he said simply. The chamber fell silent. Veltar's scaled features twisted into what might have been a smile. "Of course," he replied, his tone suggesting he was granting a condemned prisoner a final meal. "Council protocol demands it. You have one full rotation cycle to prepare your case." As delegates began filing out of the chamber, their conversations buzzing with anticipation of humanity's inevitable downfall, Minho activated his personal communicator. The small device projected a secure channel back to the human embassy ship, orbiting the council station. "Park Ji-hyo," he said quietly, "begin Phase 1. It's time they learned the truth about why they really can't get rid of us." The crystal dome of the Galactic Council gleamed under the triple suns as Ambassador Park Ji-hyo walked toward the central podium. Her black hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her dark suit made her look like she was attending a funeral. In many ways, she was about to conduct one for the Council's carefully constructed version of history. The assembled delegates watched with the confidence of predators who had already cornered their prey. Ambassador Veltar coiled comfortably in his seat, his serpentine form radiating satisfaction. Representative Korth's compound eyes glittered with anticipation. Even the usually neutral whisper singers hummed with what sounded like amusement. Ji-hyo reached the podium and placed her hands on its smooth surface. Behind her, the air shimmered as holographic projectors came online, filling the space above the chamber with a three-dimensional star map that showed the galaxy as it had existed 300 years ago. "Let me tell you a story," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the dome's perfect acoustics. "A story about the Kree people." The star map zoomed in on a cluster of blue-white stars in the outer spiral. Beautiful worlds appeared in the display, covered in crystalline cities that caught and reflected light, like scattered diamonds. The Kree had been artists and philosophers, their entire civilization built around the pursuit of beauty and knowledge. Kree were pacifists, Ji-hyo continued. They had no military, no weapons of war. They believed that all conflicts could be resolved through discussion and compromise. They were wrong. The holographic display shifted, showing massive dreadnought ships emerging from hyperspace around the Kree worlds. The Vorthak Empire's vessels were ugly things, built for destruction rather than exploration. They looked like metallic tumors bristling with weapon systems and armored in black steel that seemed to absorb light. The Vorthak Empire declared the Kree to be genetically inferior and began what they called species cleansing, Ji-hyo said. The display showed the first bombardments, beautiful crystal cities exploding into fragments that fell like deadly rain. The Kree sent desperate messages across the galaxy, begging for help. In the council chamber, several delegates shifted uncomfortably. They remembered those transmissions, the desperate pleas for intervention that had filled their communication networks for months. The holographic display zoomed out to show the council chamber as it had existed 3 centuries ago. The same crystal dome, the same spiral seating arrangement, but filled with different faces representing civilizations that were younger then, less experienced in the art of political convenience. This council debated for 4 months, Ji-hyo continued. Committee after committee was formed. Subcommittees were created to study the committees. Investigation teams were dispatched to write reports that would be reviewed by oversight panels. The display showed those ancient debates, delegates arguing passionately about jurisdiction and proper procedure, while the Kree worlds burned in the background. Ambassador Veltar's predecessor, another Serpentine hegemony representative, had been particularly vocal about the need to follow proper diplomatic channels. Meanwhile, Jihyo said, her voice growing colder, the Vorthak fleet systematically destroyed every Kree world. They didn't just kill the population they sterilized, entire planets, turning them into dead rocks that couldn't support life ever again. The holographic Kree worlds went dark one by one, their beautiful cities replaced by glowing craters and poisoned atmospheres. Refugee ships fled desperately through space, many breaking down from overuse as they carried far more passengers than they were designed for. After 4 months of debate, this council finally reached a decision, Jihyo announced. Ayu voted to strongly condemn the Vorthak actions and to encourage all parties to seek diplomatic solutions. A bitter laugh escaped from somewhere in the human delegation seating. The sound echoed strangely in the dome, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. By then, there were no parties left to seek solutions with, Jihyo continued. The Kree population had been reduced from 12 billion to less than 2 million refugees, scattered across a dozen failing ships. The display changed again, showing a small fleet of human vessels approaching the refugee convoy. The human ships were nothing impressive by galactic standards, crude, boxy things that looked like they had been built in asteroid mining facilities rather than proper shipyards. But they moved with purpose, their engines burning bright as they accelerated toward the disaster zone. Humanity had only been in space for 50 years, Jihyo explained. We had 3 colonies and a merchant fleet that was considered primitive by galactic standards, but we had something this council lacked the ability to act. The holographic display showed human ships forming protective formations around the Kree refugees. When Vorthak pursuit vessels arrived, expecting easy prey, they found themselves facing an enemy that fought with desperate creativity. Human ships used ramming attacks, suicide runs, and tactics that no civilized species would consider. We evacuated 4 million Kree to safety, Jihyo stated. Our ships carried refugees to uninhabited worlds where they could rebuild. We gave them tools, supplies, and protection while they established new colonies. The display showed the aftermath, human ships limping back to Earth, many badly damaged from the fighting. It also showed the Kree survivors beginning to rebuild their civilization on new worlds, their crystal cities rising again under alien suns. This council's response was swift and decisive, Jihyo continued with heavy sarcasm. We were formally censured for overstepping jurisdictional boundaries and interfering in internal galactic affairs. Representative Korth clicked his mandibles nervously. He had been part of that censure vote, fresh from his appointment to the council, and eager to prove his commitment to proper procedure. The holographic display shifted again, showing a timeline that stretched across the centuries. 17 different incidents appeared, each marked with the distinctive red and blue of human intervention. The Zephyrian Plague, Jihyo announced, pointing to one of the markers. A bioweapon accidentally released from a research station. This council formed a medical committee to study the problem. The committee determined that developing a cure would cost approximately 4 billion credits and take 6 years. The display showed Zephyrian colonies dying by the millions, their jellyfish-like bodies dissolving as the plague consumed them from within. Then human medical ships appeared, crude hospital vessels that had been converted from cargo haulers. Human doctors worked around the clock for 8 months, Jihyo continued. We lost 300 medical personnel to the plague before we developed a cure. Total cost, 40 million credits and 8 months of time. More incidents appeared in the display. The Stellar Consortium's slave markets, which had operated openly for decades, while the Council conducted ongoing investigations. Human raiders had shut them down in a series of lightning strikes that freed over 1 million enslaved beings. The Carathian famine, where a mining accident had poisoned an entire planet's food supply. The Council had calculated that relocating the population would be more cost-effective than cleaning up the contamination. Human terraforming ships had spent 2 years scrubbing the planet clean instead. The Proxima Station incident, where corporate executives had been using prisoners as test subjects for experimental medical procedures. The Council had been monitoring the situation for 5 years when human Special Forces teams raided the facility and freed the victims. 17 interventions, Jihyo repeated, her voice cutting through the chamber's increasingly uncomfortable silence. 17 times we acted when you would not. Each time we saved lives, you were willing to sacrifice for the sake of proper procedure. Ambassador Veltar finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a hiss than his usual smooth tones. Those were complex situations, he protested. There were legal considerations, diplomatic implications, economic factors. Yes, Jihyo agreed, turning to face him directly. Too complex for committees to handle, too complicated for bureaucrats to navigate, too difficult for politicians to risk their careers over. She gestured toward the holographic timeline, which still showed the 17 incidents glowing in the air above the chamber. But simple enough for conscience, she concluded. Simple enough for people who understood that sometimes doing the right thing matters more than following the right procedure. The chamber fell into an uncomfortable silence as delegates stared at the evidence of their own inaction hanging in the air above them. The beautiful holographic displays told a story they had all lived through but had never seen presented so. Starkly the story of a council that talked while people died, and of one species that acted when action was needed. Park Ji-yo stood quietly at the podium, letting the weight of history settle over the assembled representatives. Tomorrow, they would hear about economics and military capabilities, but today she had reminded them of something far more uncomfortable, the moral cost of their civilized restraint. Kim Tae-hyung walked to the center of the council chamber with the calm confidence of someone who held all the cards in a high-stakes game. His black briefcase clicked open with a soft sound that somehow seemed to echo through the massive crystal dome. Inside, rows of data tablets glowed with information that would change everything the assembled delegates thought they knew. About galactic economics. The young economic attaché looked nothing like the typical image of a destroyer of civilizations. His dark hair was neatly styled, his suit perfectly pressed, and his expression remained pleasantly neutral as he activated the chamber's holographic systems. But the data tablets in his hands contained numbers that could bring entire star systems to their knees. Honored delegates, Tae-hyung began, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone reading a weather report. Let's discuss what removing humanity from the council would actually mean in practical terms. The air above the chamber shimmered as a three-dimensional map of the galaxy materialized. Unlike yesterday's historical displays, this one pulsed, with a real-time flow of commerce that kept galactic civilization running. Shipping lanes appeared as glowing threads of light, connecting star systems in an intricate web that stretched across 3 spiral arms. Several delegates immediately pulled out their own data devices, their faces showing the first hints of concern as they began cross-referencing the information with their own economic databases. Our so-called unauthorized colonies, Tae-hyung continued, highlighting dozens of human settlements that appeared as bright nodes in the galactic trade network, happen to control 43% of all major shipping lanes. Not by accident, but by necessity. The display zoomed in on specific regions, showing how human outposts had been strategically placed at gravitational jump points, asteroid belt mining stations, and refueling depots that served vessels from dozens of different species. What had appeared to be random expansion was revealed as a carefully planned network of essential infrastructure. Ambassador Veltar's serpentine form shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His own hegemony's merchant fleets relied heavily on those same human-controlled waypoints for their most profitable trade routes. The Kepler Junction alone, Tae-hyung noted, pointing to a human station that sat at the intersection of 5 major hyperspace lanes, processes 67 million tons of cargo annually. The Proxima Relay handles fuel and supplies for 800 different shipping companies. The New Horizon mining complex provides 17% of the galaxy's tritium supply. Representative Korth's compound eyes reflected the holographic display as he frantically calculated the implications. His species' entire manufacturing base depended on materials that flowed through human-controlled checkpoints, but Tai-Hyung was just getting started. The display shifted to show industrial production centers scattered throughout human space. Massive orbital factories around Earth's sun collected solar energy on a scale that dwarfed anything else in the galaxy. Asteroid mining operations in the Sol system pulled rare elements from rocks that other species couldn't even detect. 61% of the rare Earth elements required for faster-than-light travel come from human operations, Tai-Hyung announced. The quantum crystalline matrices that power your jump drives. We mine the base materials from asteroids that our technology can track through dimensional fold space, the exotic matter that stabilizes your hyperspace tunnels. Our deep space collectors harvest it from regions that would kill most other species. The economic data flowing across the display was staggering. Human industrial capacity had grown exponentially over the past century, driven by their willingness to work in environments that other species considered too dangerous or unprofitable. The whisper singers, beings of pure energy contained in crystalline shells, began humming in frequencies that made the chamber walls vibrate with anxiety. Their entire civilization depended on energy conversion technology that used human-produced components. But perhaps most interesting, Tai-Hyung continued with the same pleasant tone, is our medical technology exports. The display showed a complex web of pharmaceutical and medical device shipments flowing from human worlds to every corner of the galaxy. Life extension treatments, genetic therapies, cybernetic implants, and regenerative medicines that had revolutionized healthcare across dozens of species. The treatments that have extended average lifespans across the galaxy by 30% over the past century. Human innovation, the neural interface technology that allows the Carathians to control their mining equipment, developed in laboratories on Mars. The biocompatibility drugs that let the Zephyrians survive in non-aquatic environments, created by human biochemists. Representative Korth's translator crackled as he tried to speak, his clicking mandibles betraying his growing agitation. The insectoid delegate had personally benefited from human life extension treatments that had added decades to his natural lifespan. The holographic display shifted again, this time showing the massive defensive platforms that orbited the core, worlds of every major civilization. The sleek, angular structures bristled with weapons and shield generators that had kept the galactic peace for generations. Those planetary defense systems protecting your homeworlds, Tai-Hyung asked rhetorically. Built-in Sol system factories using human engineering and manufacturing techniques. The particle beam arrays, the quantum shield generators, the automated defense drones they're all stamped with, made by humans, in languages you probably never bothered to learn. The implications were becoming clear to even the most stubborn delegates. Humanity hadn't just integrated itself into the galactic economy, they had become its backbone. Remove them, and the entire structure would collapse like a house of cards in a solar storm. Tai-Hyung activated another data tablet, and new numbers appeared in the holographic display, economic projections that made several delegates gasp in their species' equivalent of shock. Conservative estimates suggest that expelling humanity from the Council would result in immediate supply chain disruptions affecting 87% of galactic commerce, he stated calmly. Industrial production would drop by 40 to 60% within 6 months. Medical supplies would become scarce within a year. Defensive capabilities would be reduced to pre-war levels. The numbers kept flowing. Unemployment rates that would skyrocket across dozens of worlds. Trade deficits that would bankrupt entire star systems. Technological gaps that would take centuries to fill. What had started as righteous indignation about human rule-breaking was rapidly becoming an exercise in civilizational suicide. Representative Korth finally found his voice, his translator crackling with electronic distortion as his emotional state interfered with the device's normal function. "You're threatening us," he accused, his compound eyes flashing with anger and fear. "This is economic terrorism." The chamber erupted in similar accusations. Tentacles waved, crystals pulsed with agitated light, and harmonious voices rose in discord as delegates realized the trap they had walked into. But then another voice cut through the chaos, calm and clear and utterly unimpressed by the theatrical outrage. "Nurse," Ambassador Song Hyejin said as she rose from the human delegation seating, "we're informing you." The chamber fell silent as all attention focused on the new speaker. Song Hyejin was older than the other human representatives, her gray-streaked, hair and lined face, speaking of decades of diplomatic experience. When she spoke, there was no emotion in her voice, no trace of threat or intimidation. Just the simple presentation of facts that everyone in the chamber now understood were absolutely true. "There's a difference between a threat and a fact," she continued, her dark eyes scanning the assembled delegates. "A threat is when someone tells you they'll hurt you if you don't do what they want. A fact is when someone explains the natural consequences of your own choices." She gestured toward the holographic display, which still showed the intricate web of galactic commerce with human settlements as its crucial connecting points. "We didn't force you to become dependent on our infrastructure," she stated simply. "We didn't make you rely on our medical technology or defensive systems. You chose to use our services because they were better, cheaper, and more reliable than the alternatives." The uncomfortable truth settled over the chamber like a heavy blanket. Humanity hadn't conquered the galactic economy through force or manipulation. They had simply done what they always did. They had seen problems that needed solving and had gone ahead and solved them, regardless of whether they had permission or not. The silence stretched on as delegates began calculating not just the economic cost of expelling humanity, but the deeper implications of what they had just learned. The species they had been preparing to banish as troublemakers had quietly become indispensable to their very survival. Kim Tae-hyung closed his briefcase with the same soft click that had opened it, the sound somehow carrying more finality than any dramatic speech could have managed. General Zhao's reptilian scales shifted from their usual calm green to a mottled pattern of yellow and brown as he approached the central podium. His clawed feet clicked against the crystal floor with a rhythm that betrayed his nervousness. As the Council's supreme military advisor, he had access to classified intelligence that most delegates never saw, and what he knew about human military capabilities kept him awake during his species' natural hibernation cycles. The massive alien cleared his throat, a sound like grinding stone that echoed through the chamber's perfect acoustics. His throat sac inflated and deflated as he prepared to reveal secrets that could change the balance of power in the galaxy forever. "Esteemed colleagues," Zhao began, his voice carrying the weight of someone about to deliver very bad news, "I must share intelligence that our defense analysts have been studying for the past decade. What we have discovered about human military technology is concerning." The holographic display above the chamber flickered to life, showing technical schematics that made several delegates lean forward in their seats. The designs looked deceptively simple compared to the elegant energy weapons and defensive systems used by most galactic civilizations. "While our species have spent centuries perfecting plasma cannons, particle beams, and quantum shields," Zhao continued, his scales now showing distinct stress patterns, "humanity has taken a different approach. They have weaponized physics itself." The display zoomed in on a cross-section of a human kinetic bombardment system. It looked almost primitive, a series of dense metal rods loaded into magnetic acceleration tubes. But the technical specifications made Representative Korth's compound eyes dilate with shock. "These devices accelerate projectiles to 97% of light speed," Zhao explained. "At that velocity, a piece of metal the size of your fist carries more destructive energy than our most powerful plasma warheads. And, unlike energy weapons, there is no known defense against them." The simulation that followed was terrifying in its simplicity. A human warship, barely a third the size of a Council dreadnought, fired a single kinetic round at a heavily shielded target. The projectile passed through energy barriers like they were soap bubbles, punched through armor plating like it was paper, and continued traveling until it had drilled completely through a moon-sized battle station. Several delegates made sounds of distress in their native languages. The whisper singers' harmonic tones became discordant with fear, while the aquatic tidewalkers began rapidly cycling water through their breathing apparatus in what was clearly panic. But the kinetic weapons are not the most disturbing aspect of human military doctrine, Zhao continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. It is their willingness to use them. The display shifted to show actual combat footage from human military operations over the past century. Unlike the careful, ritualized warfare practiced by most galactic species, human combat was chaotic, brutal, and utterly without mercy for anyone who threatened civilian populations. The Battle of Kepler Station, Zhao announced as grainy footage, showed human fighters swarming around massive pirate vessels. The human ships were tiny by comparison, but they moved like angry wasps, darting in to deliver devastating strikes before disappearing into the void. 47 human vessels destroyed a pirate fleet of over 200 ships. Total human casualties: 832 killed, 1,012 wounded. The footage showed human pilots ramming their fighters into enemy capital, ships when their weapons ran out of ammunition. It showed damaged human vessels making suicide runs on pirate command centers, rather than allow themselves to be captured. Every other species in this council fights to achieve objectives while minimizing casualties, Zhao explained, his scales now showing the deep orange patterns that indicated extreme stress in his people. Humans fight to eliminate threats, regardless of cost. More combat simulations appeared in the display, showing war games that the Council's military had run using human tactical doctrines. In scenario after scenario, human forces either achieved complete victory or chose to destroy everything, rather than accept defeat. The Proxima war games, Zhao continued, pointing to a particularly disturbing simulation. We presented human commanders with an impossible situation, outnumbered 10 to 1, cut off from reinforcements, facing inevitable capture. Every other species' response was to surrender and negotiate terms. The holographic display showed what the human commanders had chosen instead. When defeat became inevitable, they had ordered their ships to overload their reactors and ram enemy vessels. The resulting chain reaction had destroyed both fleets and rendered the entire star system uninhabitable. They calculated that mutual destruction was preferable to allowing their enemies to learn from captured technology, Zhao said, his voice barely audible now. They chose annihilation over subjugation. Representative Korth's mandibles clicked frantically as he processed this information. The insectoid had served in his species' military for centuries, but the concept of choosing death over surrender was completely alien to his thinking. The display shifted again, showing intelligence reports about human military production capabilities. Hidden factories in asteroid belts, automated shipyards in the outer reaches of their solar system, weapons testing facilities that operated in complete secrecy. Our best estimates suggest that humanity's true military capacity is approximately 3 to 4 times what they have publicly revealed, Zhao admitted. They maintain separate fleets for exploration, defense, and what they call special operations. The last category is particularly concerning. Footage appeared of human special forces operations, small teams infiltrating heavily defended facilities, ghost ships appearing from hyperspace to conduct precision strikes, and commando units that seemed to materialize out of nowhere to rescue prisoners or eliminate targets. Human military doctrine is based on what they call asymmetric warfare, Zhao explained. They do not seek to match enemy strength with superior strength. Instead, they find weaknesses and exploit them with surgical precision. The implications were staggering. Every major military installation in the galaxy had been designed to repel conventional attacks from energy weapons and particle beams. None of them could withstand kinetic bombardment from weapons that traveled at near light speed. But even more terrifying was the psychological profile that emerged from the intelligence reports. Humans didn't just fight wars, they ended them. They escalated conflicts until their enemies either surrendered completely or were destroyed entirely. There was no middle ground, no negotiated peace that left threats intact. Ambassador Veltar's serpentine form had coiled so tightly that he resembled a spring under tension. "Surely you're not suggesting that humanity could challenge the combined might of the entire Council," he hissed. General Zhao's scales shifted to the deep red patterns that indicated absolute certainty in his species. "I'm suggesting that humanity wouldn't need to challenge us," he replied. "They would simply need to make victory so costly that we would prefer to leave them alone." The chamber fell into an uncomfortable silence as delegates contemplated this new reality. They had called this emergency session to expel a troublesome species that wouldn't follow their rules. Instead, they had discovered that the troublesome species possessed the military capability to destroy galactic civilization if pushed too far. Finally, Ambassador Lee Minho rose from his seat in the human delegation area. He walked to the podium with the same calm confidence he had shown throughout the proceedings, his expression never changing, even as he addressed the most powerful military leaders in the galaxy. "General Zhao has presented accurate information," Minho said simply, "but he has missed the most important point." The human ambassador looked around the chamber, making eye contact with delegates from dozens of different species. When he spoke, again, his voice carried a quiet intensity that made everyone lean forward to hear him. "We don't fight to win," he said, each word carefully measured. "We fight to end wars. Sometimes that requires being willing to lose everything to ensure that the war truly ends." The implications of that statement settled over the chamber like a cold shroud. Humanity couldn't be forced into compliance because they would choose mutual annihilation over subjugation. They couldn't be intimidated because they had already calculated the acceptable cost of their own destruction. The species that the Council had been preparing to expel as troublemakers had revealed themselves to be something far more dangerous, a civilization that would rather burn down the galaxy than allow it to be ruled by those who valued order over justice. In the silence that followed, several delegates began to understand why humanity's unauthorized interventions had never been successfully stopped. It wasn't because the Council lacked the power to enforce its will. It was because the cost of enforcing that will might be higher than anyone was prepared to pay. The crystal dome of the Galactic Council had never felt smaller than it did as Ambassador Park Ji-hyo returned to the central podium for humanity's final statement. The weight of 3 days of revelations hung in the recycled atmosphere like a toxic cloud. Delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats, many avoiding eye contact with the human delegation entirely. Ji-hyo stood at the podium with the bearing of a surgeon preparing to make a final, decisive cut. Behind her, the holographic displays had been turned off, leaving only the natural light filtering through the crystal walls to illuminate her stark black uniform. She didn't need visual aids for what she was about to say. The truth required no special effects. "Honored delegates," she began, her voice carrying the cold precision of someone who had spent 3 days systematically dismantling every comfortable lie the Council told itself. "We have reached the moment of decision. But before you vote, let me tell you what this is really about." The chamber held its breath. Even the usually restless Zephyrians had stopped their constant movement, their jellyfish-like forms floating motionless in their environmental bubbles. "You don't want to expel humanity because we violate your protocols," Ji-hyo continued, her dark eyes scanning the assembled representatives. "You want to expel us because we expose what you have become." Representative Korth's compound eyes reflected the chamber's light as he leaned forward, his massive insectoid form suddenly very still. Ambassador Veltar's serpentine coils had gone rigid, his scaled features frozen in an expression of growing dread. "Look around this chamber," Ji-hyo commanded, gesturing to the spiral seating arrangement that rose toward the crystal dome. "What do you see? Representatives of 47 advanced civilizations, each with technology that could transform worlds, with resources that could end suffering across the galaxy, with the collective power to solve any problem that exists." Yumai paused, letting that image settle in their minds before delivering the killing blow. "And what do you do with all that power? You form committees, you debate, you study, you investigate. You hold hearings and write reports and schedule follow-up meetings to discuss the findings of the preliminary review panels." The words hit the chamber like physical blows. Several delegates made sounds of protest, but Ji-hyo wasn't finished. "The terms. Kree genocide lasted 8 months while you debated jurisdiction. The Zephyrian plague killed 60 million beings while you calculated cost-effectiveness. The Stellar Consortium's slave markets operated for decades while you conducted ongoing investigations. Ambassador Veltar's serpentine form began to uncoil, his anger overriding his political caution. Those were complex situations requiring careful— Careful what? Jihyo interrupted, her voice cutting through his objection like a plasma cutter through hull plating. Careful consideration, careful planning, careful excuses for why you couldn't act. The hegemony representative's forked tongue flicked out in agitation. We follow proper procedures. We believe in the rule of law. You believe in the comfort of collective responsibility, Jihyo shot back. When 47 species agree to do nothing, no single species has to take the blame for the consequences. The chamber erupted in angry voices. Tentacles waved, crystals pulsed with indignant light, and harmonious tones became discordant with outrage. But through it all, Park Jihyo stood unmoved at the podium, waiting for the storm to pass. When silence finally returned, she continued with the same surgical precision. Every species in this chamber seeks the same things: consensus, approval, the warm feeling of knowing that everyone agrees with your decisions. You want to be liked. You want to be seen as reasonable, diplomatic, civilized. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing every delegate to strain to hear her words. Humans act on principle regardless of consequence. When we see children being murdered, we don't form a committee to study the optimal response. When we find people being enslaved, we don't schedule hearings to determine proper jurisdiction. When plagues threaten entire populations, we don't calculate whether intervention is cost-effective. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the chamber's life support systems seemed to have quieted, as if the station itself was holding its breath. You call us reckless, Jihyo said, her words echoing in the vast dome. We call you cowards. The insult hit like a shockwave. Ambassador Veltar rose from his seat, his serpentine form towering above the surrounding delegates, his scales flushed with rage. How dare you, he hissed, his voice carrying the authority of a civilization that had ruled star systems when humans were still learning to make fire. We are the inheritors of galactic civilization. We have maintained peace for over 1,000 years. The Kree children we saved would dare, Jihyo replied without missing a beat. The slaves we freed from the consortium markets would dare. The Zephyrian families who survived the plague because human doctors risked their lives would dare. She turned to face the hegemony ambassador directly, her expression never changing from its mask of cold professionalism. The millions of beings who are alive today because humanity chose action over deliberation would dare to call you what you are, cowards who value your own comfort more than other people's lives. The chamber fell silent again, but this time the silence carried a different quality. It was the silence of people confronting truths they had spent centuries avoiding. Representative Korth's mandibles clicked nervously as he processed what he had just heard. The insectoid had lived for over 300 years, serving on dozens of committees and commissions. He had written reports that filled entire data archives. He had participated in debates that lasted for decades. And in all that time, he had never once acted to save a single life that his government hadn't already decided was worth saving. You need us, Jihyo continued, her voice carrying across the chamber like a death sentence, precisely because we are willing to be what you cannot. The ones who act when action is required. The ones who take responsibility when responsibility is uncomfortable. The ones who make the hard choices that keep your consciences clean. The vote was finally called. The chamber's voting system activated with a soft chime that seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. Representatives began casting their decisions, their choices appearing as points of light on the central display. The count progressed, slowly. Yes votes for expulsion, no votes for retention, and a disturbing number of abstentions from delegates who couldn't bring themselves to choose either option. The final tally hung in the air above the chamber like a judgment from the gods themselves. Motion to expel humanity. 18. Yes, 25 no. 4. Abstentions. The motion had failed, but barely. The margin was so narrow that several delegates looked surprised by their own choices. Ambassador Song Hyejin approached the podium for humanity's final statement. The older woman moved with the careful dignity of someone who had spent decades in diplomatic service. but her eyes held the same unwavering intensity that had characterized all of humanity's representatives throughout this proceeding. "The galaxy doesn't need another species seeking approval," she said, her voice carrying easily through the chamber's perfect acoustics. "It already has 47 of those." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of absolute truth. What the galaxy needs is someone willing to do what's necessary when being righteous isn't enough. Someone willing to be the villain when being the hero fails. Someone willing to act when action is required, regardless of whether they have permission. She looked around the chamber, making eye contact with delegates who had spent the past 3 days learning uncomfortable truths about themselves and their civilizations. "That's why we can't be banned from this council," she concluded. "Not because you love us, but because you need us. Deep down, in the parts of your souls that you try not to examine too closely, you know that someone has to be willing to get their hands dirty so that yours can stay clean." The chamber began emptying before she had even finished speaking. Delegates filed out in small groups, avoiding eye contact with each other, and speaking in hushed tones that carried undertones of shame and relief. They had voted to keep humanity in the council, but they couldn't bring themselves to celebrate the decision. Ambassador Veltar slithered past the human delegation without acknowledgement, his scales showing the mottled patterns that indicated deep emotional turmoil in his species. Representative Korth's compound eyes reflected the chamber's lights as he clicked past, his mandibles sealed shut in what might have been embarrassment or gratitude. Within minutes, the great crystal dome was empty except for the human delegation. They sat quietly in their isolated seating area, watching the last few stragglers disappear through the chamber's exits. "Think they learned anything?" asked Kim Tae-hyung, gathering his economic data tablets. "They learned that they need us," replied Park Ji-ho. "Whether they learned why they need us remains to be seen." Ambassador Lee Min-ho stood and straightened his jacket, preparing to leave the chamber where humanity had just secured its place in galactic civilization through the most uncomfortable means possible, by telling the truth. "Does it matter?" he asked quietly. "We'll keep doing what we've always done. We'll act when action is needed, save who needs saving, and stop what needs stopping, whether they approve or not." The human delegation gathered their materials and walked toward the exit, leaving behind a chamber that would never quite feel the same. The truth had been spoken, and it could not be unheard. Humanity would remain in the Galactic Council not because they were loved, but because they were necessary, and sometimes being necessary was more important than being liked. The end.